All right, well, thank you everyone so much. Good afternoon and welcome to the third installment of the Spring 2021 QSIDE Colloquium series. We are really excited to have you all here today. My name's Jude Higdon and I'm the Chief Operations Officer at QSIDE. A few operational notes. At the end of this session, we'll adjourn to a standard Zoom meeting for an informal cocktail coffee hour where we can chat more informally with one another. So if your schedule permits, please stick around for that. We'd also like to encourage any of you who are joining us today who are not officially members of our affiliate program or our consortium to consider joining. The affiliate program is free to join. It's a members group and has a couple of different opportunities, and my colleague Emily will post the links to that in the chat so you all can click to see more about that program. The consortium is a paid membership program, although if you want to join and budgets are tight, which they are for everyone, please feel free to reach out and we can talk about scholarship opportunities. And Emily will include a link to that as well in the chat. Thank you, Emily. Today's colloquium is the third of 6 to come this spring, and an installment in this a lot of exciting programming we have planned for QSIDE in 2021. Our colloquium series features 6 speakers who will discuss issues related to theory, activism, and technical tools to shed light on a broad range of topics related to inclusion, diversity, and equity. Please visit our colloquium webpage and considering registering for and sharing information about the other talks we have planned with colleagues who may be interested. Our past colloquium talks can be accessed via our YouTube channel, and Emily will also include the link to that in the chat. We're also incredibly excited to announce the inaugural launch of our Data for Justice conference, which will be taking place on April 16th, 2021. It's a virtual event and it will feature talks from experts in our 5 research foci areas: inclusion in the arts, criminal justice, healthcare equity, environmental justice, and education equity, with a keynote from Heather McGhee, the former president of Demos and co-chair of Color of Change. Our first 200 registrants will receive a free copy of Heather McGhee's latest book, which comes out in March. It's titled The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Registration is open and scholarships are available if you would like to attend, and budgeting is a challenge. And we will also include a link to that in the chat. If you'd like to support QSIDE and the production of our exciting research and activism initiatives, we graciously appreciate any and all donations made to our organization. Your support keeps us going. As we progress through our session today, please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A feature of the webinar. We'll have time at the end of the presentation to discuss questions with Gaelan. And one last note, please be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be displayed publicly on the QSIDE web and social media channels. And now it's my great privilege to introduce today's speaker, Gaelan Smith. Gaelan is based in New York City and specializes in data visualization, layout, and print media and knowledge management. His technical writing and data storytelling focus on plain, accessible language to answer the audience's questions, spark their curiosity, and drive their decisions. As a neurodiverse queer trans person, he is deeply committed to seeing and dismantling systemic barriers. He has designed inclusive, actionable projects for Rockefeller University, Cleary Gottlieb Steen and Hamilton LLC, New York City Department of Education, and more. He mentored high school students of color to design an interactive, data-driven presentation of their original research on reducing school food waste to the United Nations, the CEO of schools at Sodexo, Barclays, and more. They nailed it. Gaelan has lived all over the US and believes y'all is the most inclusive form of address, which I love. I'll have to think about that. I'm from Kentucky myself, so that feels native to me. Our talk with Gaelan today will explore how labels, colors, placement, flow, and accompanying text and data visualization are as critically important to the intended message as the data itself. And with that, Gaelan Smith.
Excellent. Thank you, Jude. Let's see if we make the technology happen here. All right, am I showing the right thing? I'm going to assume that you'll tell
Actually,
me.
we have your, we have your,
Oh, there we go.
There we go. There we go. Perfect.
Hang on. Let's just try all that again.
Boom. Got it.
Excellent. Still see it? It's all good? Okay.
All good. We're seeing what we should see and not seeing what we shouldn't. Perfect.
All right, good. A year into this, we'll figure out Zoom eventually, right? Thank you for that intro. Jude, to you and Chad and everyone at QSIDE for inviting me and for holding this critical and necessary series. I also want to give a shout out to the fantastic QSIDE interns, especially Kendall and Mac, who produced such great work this fall. It was a pleasure to work with them. I'm Gaelan Smith, and since we're going to talk a lot about labels today, here's some of mine. Tall, he, him, US born, urban dweller, small town raised, sibling, trans, queer, and data analysis and visualization engineer at Cleary Gottlieb, a law firm in New York City, as well as freelance data viser and graphic designer. Welcome to a discussion about why labels matter. Most of us have a need to be seen, to be represented in the world around us. We want to find others like us, to know that we aren't alone or forgotten or ignored. We want to know that when somebody says, this is what is, we're a part of that. Commonly, the people who say labels don't matter are those that already see themselves represented in the media, in our workplaces, and in the forms and surveys that populate data sets. Their representation is so ubiquitous that they don't even realize it's there. They have the luxury, the privilege, to pretend that labels don't matter because their labels are always available, always included. Far too many people are not represented, not seen, and the language we use is a big part of that. Data visualization, those charts and graphs that range from a bar chart in Excel to gorgeous data art, has been used for advocacy to make sure people and issues are seen since its earliest days. Many of you may know Florence Nightingale as a nurse in the 1850s and 60s. She was a total badass in a lot of ways. What many people don't know, though, is that she was a star statistician and is one of the founders of DataViz. She invented some of her charts whole cloth, and they're still used today, like this rose or cockscomb chart. It highlighted that many soldiers in the Crimean War weren't dying from wounds on the battlefield, shown in pink. They were dying from unsanitary conditions in the hospital, in blue. She later focused on the British Army in India, where she showed that bad drainage, contaminated water, overcrowding, and poor ventilation were causing high death rates. These charts revolutionized hospital cleanliness and saved lives. The final report on India showed that after making these changes, the death rate dropped from 69 per 1,000 soldiers to 18 per 1,000 soldiers. Thanks to Jeffrey Schaefer from Data Plus Science for this and many other fantastic insights. It's okay if you can't read this right away. She knew her audience and made it for them. But I bet as soon as I told you what the colors meant, even without fully comprehending this chart, you saw just how dramatic the difference was. Her visual language was arresting. It stopped the Health Commission in its tracks. She spoke the language they knew to guide them where she needed them to go. Florence Nightingale had a purpose to her charts to make sure her soldiers were seen. She knew her audience. She told them the questions they needed to ask, and then she told them the answers. She used language that brought the administrators and politicians to where she wanted them, to a place to make change. Data viz advocacy is stronger than ever today. There's an organization called Viz for Social Good that champions Viz's making an impact. For some, that's addressing clean water needs. Others advocate for a youth mentorship program. They hold regular competitions to encourage people to build visualizations with a purpose. There are a huge number of COVID dashboards, many advocating for an appropriate number and distribution of testing sites and now vaccines. Some are uncovering the racial and economic inequities. Here you see the disparity between those in Chicago who are dying from COVID versus those getting the vaccine. QSIDE is studying representation in healthcare, academia, criminal justice, and art museums, and the environment. As we learned a few weeks ago from Aruna D'Souza, more people are pushing for, demanding systemic changes in curatorial staff. The way that QSIDE asks their questions and collects their data and visualizes that information will determine their contribution to this crucial discussion. Now, some of your work is clearly in the world of advocacy and pushing for change, but some of you may feel like that isn't what you're doing, but you are. Perhaps you are the artist or curator, and the words you use to describe your work and the work of others incorporates or leaves out cultural context that fundamentally changes the interpretation of the art. Maybe you're a contractor and you use words like male and female instead of plug and socket to describe connectors. Or you're a coder and you use master and slave to describe your hierarchy instead of primary and secondary. Or perhaps you create data visualizations and you are literally using labels to define and describe the people and concepts you're representing. The language choices we make impact who is seen and who isn't. The labels we use matter in the data as it's designed and collected, in our reports or articles or discussions as we present it, and for the way our work is received, interpreted, and built on. So, what labels should we use? There are so many ways we define ourselves. How many categories can we put a single person in? I recently sent out an informal survey with as many categories as I could think of, most of which were things a person has little or no direct control over. We'll come back to that distinction in a bit. There was no multiple choice, only free text fields. Some had prompts or examples, some didn't. The answers were astounding. This is where we get participatory. I'm going to ask you to more or less take the survey now, and you'll refer back to it throughout the rest of the talk. Get out the Notes app on your phone or open a Word doc or heck, grab a pen and actual paper and take the next 60 seconds to write down every single category you can think of about yourself. I'll stop talking and put on some music so you can write. I'm going to put the categories that I included in the survey on the screen, but come up with others. What is your career and income level? How do you process information? What is your reading fluency? Were you raised in a substantially different lifestyle than you lead now? Whatever comes to mind, write it all down. How'd that go? Did you notice? Not a single one of these is binary. None of them are yes or no, in or out, A or B. Even age is relative. My parents are in their mid-70s and quite old for their age, whereas I have friends in their 80s still going on 100-mile bike rides regularly. I bet some of you wrote multiple answers for some categories. That's really common and not often captured in either data collection or our reporting. They are overlapping and intersectional. Categories give context to others. A single category might have many answers. My race impacts my sexuality. Your neuroprocessing description may take up a paragraph. I also bet your definitions and categorizations vary broadly. In my survey, which remember was entirely free text fields, of the people who listed something like mid-level for career and a number for income level, the range was mid $30,000 to $160,000. Out of 91 responses at the time I wrote this, there were 19 different responses for gender, once slightly aggregated. 12 responses were more than one gender. For sexuality, there were 27 unique-ish responses, with 16 of those listing more than one sexuality. What I found even more important, though, were the categories that people added. I had set out to include as many categories as possible that people had little control over, and I still missed some key ones. Social interaction, you know, introvert, extrovert, ambivert. Mental health. Trauma survivor. Allergies, which could arguably be included in the physical traits. I tried to make the box as big as I could, and it still wasn't big enough. Far too often, people don't even think about making the box big enough, sometimes quite literally. My colleague told me about her 6-year-old's assignment from school to create a passport about where he's from. It was a single page to share things like food, clothes, cultural activities, etc. There was one tiny box for where is your family from? This 6-year-old brings home the form and says, Mama, what am I supposed to write? Between his two parents, he is from 6 countries. All of them are important. All of them matter. How did it feel to him to be told that he had to compress his whole family into one tiny box? My colleague was having none of that and broke that visualization literally to pieces. She made 6 copies of the passport page and filled out every single one, then taped them together. That's where you're from, she said. Another huge pitfall is relying on and not questioning our assumptions. In the US, we have a legacy trope of what it looks like to be American. Usually, when someone refers to the average American city, they are vaguely gesturing to an adorable small town somewhere in the middle of the country with a cute Main Street shopping area filled with middle-class, cis, het, white people who are married, have 2 kids, a dog, maybe a cat, and their own single-family detached house with at least 1 and probably 2 cars. If you're American, are you seen in that description? Does it describe your life, where you live? Some parts of it, maybe, but probably not all of it, because that isn't actually an accurate representation of the average American or the average American city. Back in 2016, political data cruncher website 538 came out with a look at the most representative city in the US that most closely matched the overall US population. A bunch of other sites jumped on board to also look at the most American part of America. While none of their findings looked like this fictional, small, white Main Street town, they differed pretty significantly in the areas they named as most American. 538 said New Haven, Connecticut. Others said Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or Indianapolis, Indiana. Tampa, Florida was consistently high on the lists. Why did they differ so much? Because they all looked at different categories. And as obvious as it may be to say it, The categories we choose and the options within those categories substantially impact the outcome of our data and thus our reporting. Different people are seen when we choose different data, ask different groups, and label it in different ways. Our choices must make room for everyone. Most designers know by now to test for color blindness. Why? Because 8% of the population is colorblind, so why would you exclude them? Other choices are as or more important. What about screen readers? Can they parse your website or PDF full of images? Can someone with limited attention span grasp the main meaning of your message? If you have a physical display or object or space, can people with different forms of movement or body configurations interact with it? What if they can't feel sensation in their fingertips or have no fingers? Can they still appreciate and get something from your work? Do people with big bodies fit into your work, literally or figuratively? Think about the images you use. At almost 6 feet tall, I see a crowd of people very differently than my 5'2" friends, and even more so than someone in a wheelchair. If your design includes a crowd scene, will it make sense to everyone? Does it appeal to everyone in the same way? Will it induce anxiety in some that could be detrimental to your message? We must also be aware of the invisible design choices, many of which are made for us. As I was preparing for this presentation, I mentioned to RJ Andrews from Info We Trust that I sincerely hope people aren't using pink for girls and blue for boys, how that's a recent but pervasive representation and fraught for so many reasons. He agreed with me and then brought up the red and blue colors for US political parties. My eyes popped open. It hadn't occurred to me to talk about that. It hadn't occurred to me to question that. Why do we use red and blue? And why for those parties? What would it mean to use something different? What haven't you questioned? Are you unintentionally reinforcing stereotypes or relying on unexamined, overused connotations? Context also matters. Who is asking the question, who is included in the data set, and who is visualizing the data all have impact. A trans researcher asking me about my choices in transitioning is a radically different topic than a cis person asking the same question. Who we ask and how we ask them is also important. The city of New York wanted to look at ways communities deal with inaccessible housing. They surveyed people in the shelter system, those who are unhoused, and various other forms of temporary and group housing arrangements. They concluded, essentially, that there was no problem with unstable housing in the Asian dominant neighborhoods, such as Chinatown. Great, right? They hadn't translated their survey into any Asian languages. Nor did the researchers, people supposed to be the authority on housing in one of the largest and most diverse cities in the world, know about shift housing, the specific way that especially Chinese communities deal with temporary and unstable housing in the city. Of course, you won't find a problem in Asian communities if you don't go to where the people are and ask them in their languages. Context also demands that sometimes it's important to use certain labels, even if they grate our sensibilities today. A good example is census data. While we would never design a survey asking about colored people today, we must use that language when the context demands it. But how you label it, the explanatory text around it, the design choices you make are all critical to driving the message in the right direction. Have you used an image of a mammy in an apron as an illustration? Why? Why didn't you use a doctor or a merchant? There were plenty of Black professionals in a variety of fields, even while slavery was still legal. So while you may be required to use the language of an era, you can certainly make choices that don't reinforce harmful narratives. Whatever you do, whether it's a part of your job or in your personal life, The choices you make and the language you use matters. If you're in finance, does your billable hours data obscure those on parental leave? If you're in sales for a fertility clinic, do you use women-focused language or pregnant person language? Women aren't the only ones that get pregnant, after all. Is your transit system impacted by economic infrastructure factors that you aren't making visible? If you're a novelist, are you using qualified, community-based sensitivity readers to bring their lived experiences and perspectives to your work, even if you don't think you're writing about controversial issues? Let's go back to the list you made about yourself. I can just about guarantee that there is something on there that is outside of the mainstream set of options. Maybe you've never seen a choice for career that matches yours, or your family structure is never listed in the data sets, or your spiders are never counted among the puppies and bunnies of family pet data. How are you not being seen? What would you like others to consider when they ask their questions, when they choose their labels? Now, how can you do that for someone else? I work at a big law firm in New York City. As with many companies right now, we're looking at our diversity, and reporting is a big part of knowing where we were, where we are now, and where we should go from here. I got the test data with a rough sketch of the visualizations they wanted, with labels that had been used in the past. It wasn't great, and I wasn't going to perpetuate suboptimal labels. Our data comes from the HR paperwork that people fill out when they're hired and is updated annually. The choices for gender on the paperwork are male, female, and not declared. First, I changed the labels to men and women. Male and female have certain connotations that aren't appropriate when talking about our employees. We never discussed that change, but now almost everyone uses those words naturally. But what about that not declared option? I knew it existed because it's what I checked when I was hired. There wasn't anyone who had chosen that in the test data set though, and it wasn't in the sample vises. How would another designer have even known it was an option? I made the decision to add dummy data to my initial test data set so that the option would show up. By doing so, I made sure it was accounted for in every chart. From a design standpoint, that matters because I know I've allowed enough space for that option and given it appropriate colors, etc. But it is the human aspect that matters more. I literally made space for people. Every time someone looks at this dashboard, they will see space for those who don't choose man or woman for whatever reason. With that small decision, I'm planting in everyone's head that those people are welcome here, are part of the conversation. They are seen. As the iterations went on, several charts were hard to design when that category was included. But now, instead of glossing over it and suggesting that we leave it off until we need it, each member of the team insists on changing the viz or the scale or the placement or the explanatory text to include them. That wasn't happening when we started 6 months ago. That label choice has directly impacted the dashboard and the conversations as people look at it. But I am proud to say that the impact goes even further. HR is changing their paperwork to include more choices. That label choice, that design decision reverberated to high-level conversations saying, wait, what does not declared mean? Does that adequately represent everyone? It doesn't, so we changed it. We'll now have 7 categories: woman, trans woman, man, trans man, non-binary or third gender, identify with an identity not listed, and prefer not to disclose. These aren't perfect. They aren't absolutely every option, but they are a substantial step forward. More people will know when they start at the firm that they are seen, their colleagues are seen, that this is who we are here, and people don't need to hide or force themselves into the tiny little box that doesn't fit them. These reverberations don't stop at my firm either. We're in conversation with the national organization that collects stats from law schools and firms across the country. They're standardizing their collection forms and encouraging contributors to meet those standards. More schools and firms will see trans people simply because they are asking. We're also part of a contingent of companies pushing back on the Equal Employment Opportunity Survey that the federal government sends out every year to look at demographics in hiring and employment. The way this survey is designed on the page, you literally cannot be counted if you don't choose man or woman, and that's unacceptable. While we all know the government changes at its own glacial pace, the more pressure that prestigious companies with privilege mount, the more results we'll get. While not directly related to our work, whitehouse.gov now asks for your pronouns on their contact form. That is because people asked and used the right language and demanded that everyone be seen. Adding more choices, adding free text fields, allowing people to choose multiple options, these things make it harder for us. It's harder to design, to aggregate, to incorporate. Think back to your list. The words you chose are how you understand yourself. They should be how others understand you too. Labels are a model of understanding. They are a model for how we understand the world we're representing and how we want that world to look in the future. Florence Nightingale showed the reality for her soldiers in a way that created the future she wanted. In chapter 5 of Speaking of Graphics, Dr. Paul Louis writes, Nightingale invented her coxcombs for the purpose of communication and for persuasion of people that were contemporary with the events that described it. She was lobbying for her hospital reform. The audience she had in mind was the Health Commission and the government of her time, rather than the historian and statistician of today. This indicates that the quality of a diagram cannot be fully appreciated without also considering the historical, social, and economic context from which it arose. As such, diagrams can be witting or unwitting testimonies from the past, and one must ask for whom they were intended, for what purpose they were produced, and under what circumstances they were used. These models of understanding aren't static either. Terminology changes, sometimes rapidly. An important question to ask is, how will this be perceived in the future? Have you done the best you can with what you know now? Our list of gender options isn't comprehensive. It'll likely change and evolve. That's okay. We're doing the best we can with what we have now, and we're continuing the conversation. Our own identities aren't static either. Someone who is blind may have previously been sighted. Someone who knows 5 languages now may have grown up only knowing 1. Someone living well above the median in relative luxury may have used social nets such as unemployment or food assistance in the past. And similarly, someone on unemployment may have lived in relative luxury in the past, potentially in the quite recent past. Does your work account for these changing identities? I want to come back to the idea of those categories we choose for ourselves versus those we have little or no control over. Some of these are obvious. I was born and raised in the US and I had no control over that. Some are obvious on the other side, our hobbies, for instance. But there's a huge gray area. Did I choose my gender or even my gender presentation? What about religion? A friend was raised Unitarian Universalist, a category rarely listed as an option, by the way. As she grew into adulthood, she still belongs and wants to be part of that community. Did she choose? Was it chosen for her? In my survey, the most commonly added category was political affiliation. People seem to feel deeply that this needed to be included. It is a fundamental part of who they are. I wonder how many of you added it to your list. Does it matter that we choose our political affiliation? Is it important that many people reported that their politics differ from how they were raised? They chose to break away from what they knew, potentially severing ties with loved ones to align this with their personalities, their sense of self. Maybe this idea of chosen identities doesn't matter to your work, but maybe it does. It's part of those invisible decisions that you need to make visible. These are the types of questions to ask, to not take as given or settled or obvious. Now, I've asked you to consider a lot of questions and ideas. What does all of this mean for you, and what can you do with it? First, bake into your thought process the concept that you need to make sure everyone is seen. That is your responsibility. If your financial data obscures the impact of people on parental leave, call that out. If your market research on family pets doesn't include spiders, add it. Be curious about the lack of unstable housing situations in Chinatown. Don't be afraid to question those who designed the survey questions, or went out to collect it, or are providing the data to you, or yourself. Second, understand that you are not going to know every category, or every possible response to a category. If you ask people about their sexuality, and don't include sapiosexual because you didn't know it existed, what should those people fill in? That's being attracted to intelligence, by the way. It's okay to not know all the options, but it isn't okay to not do your best to find out. It isn't okay to not make space for everyone. Find out the options and make the box bigger. Over and over, ask this: what does my client or audience not know that I don't know that we need to know? Digging into this is going to look different for everyone, so it's tough to say, here's a list of resources to refer to. A quick internet search can help you find some things, like Coblis for testing for color blindness, or how to design for screen reader compatibility. You need to talk to the community you're studying or discussing or representing. Don't be afraid of free text fields and open-ended questions, just like you did at the beginning and the respondents did in my survey. People will tell you about themselves if you let them. The important thing is to ask and keep asking, and come from as many angles as you can think of, and ask others what angles they know about. And when you find a new angle or term or category that you didn't know about before, don't get upset or frustrated. Just incorporate it and build better. Third, question every design decision, especially the invisible ones. Why are you using those colors? Why did you place that text there instead of here? Are you making assumptions or using outdated language? Do you refer to an average American city that isn't accurate? Have you designed your charts for the not declareds of your data set? Can everyone access what you've created? Don't dismiss edge cases. Don't assume that addressing 80% or even 90% of your population is good enough. Your process and results get better as you broaden your view. It can be hard and frustrating, easy to give up and take the path others have carved, the pink for girls or red and blue for political parties, but keep questioning. Remember, a ramp for wheelchair users helps people with baby strollers. You may not know how important your inclusion efforts are, but they will have an impact. And finally, you may think that you are too junior or removed or tangential to influence the big decision makers, but you aren't. You are making choices. You are shaping the conversation. You affect how everyone views the data, the population you're discussing, and your work. Take that responsibility seriously. Speak for those who can't. Engage in the discussions. Labels matter. Being seen matters. Your choices matter. Use that to the advantage of all of us. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Gaelan. Well, we do have a couple of questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Emily to lead on that. And then I have a couple of questions at the end. If we don't have a couple more, because my brain is spinning in 1,000 directions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that talk, Gaelan. I know I learned a lot, and I'm excited to hear more of your thoughts through the questions people have asked. So first off, we have a question from Lauren. It says, I'm making data visuals that interpret vaccine hesitancy based on gender identity. What colors would you recommend I select to represent male and female identified folks, if not pink and blue?
Great question. I was kind of hoping that that particular example would spark some thought. So the historian in me wants to get into why we even use pink and blue. I'm going to TLDR that and say it comes from the Nazis, so don't do it. You know, Google will tell you lots more. It also, so not only is there the historical aspect from, you know, all of the different ways that colors have changed, but also today it has become stereotyped. It can, especially for people that fall outside of traditional gender norms, it can be hard to see and feel like it doesn't represent them. So the answer is almost anything else. And I know that's not super helpful, but I used, if you remember from the slide I showed, I use orange for women and light gray for men. Now, what I'm doing is a diversity report that is specifically showing the underrepresented communities. And so I wanted to make the underrepresented community the bright color. And I do that throughout my report. It also looks at race and ethnicity and sexuality. If that's not your aim, one, please expand beyond two. There are lots of people that are not male or female, or are both male and female, or are any number of, like I said, 19 different genders reported. So make sure you're accounting for them. And, you know, the sky's the limit. The traditional baby room nursery color, if you didn't know the gender, was green or yellow. So go for it, green or yellow. Those are my undergrad's colors, so I happen to think they go well together. You know, you could potentially get into like some brick colors. You know, you don't have to stay completely away from red because pink is in the red family, but just don't do baby pink and baby blue. It's gonna send a message that you probably don't want to send.
Yeah, thank you for that response. Next, we have a question from Chad, one of our QSIDE founders, and he says, I'm working on a project involving city jail data, and their data keeping practices leave a lot to be desired. Take gender. I'm going to recommend that inmates be allowed to declare gender as free text, but by law, say the jail has to report gender categories. Does it make sense for me to recommend a rich and humane set of categories and have inmates choose that as well?
Wow, that's a great question. And I think really gets to the heart of a lot of what I'm talking about, that I love that you've asked that. And I love that you've thought about a couple of different ways. I'm shocked, Chad, that you would come at this from different ways. So, you know, you hit on a major problem, and that's the EEO survey that I mentioned is literally a grid, and across the top is male, female, and down the side is race. And you have to put a check mark in the box where you intersect between those two. So if you aren't one of the races listed, or you aren't male or female, you literally cannot be on that form. Same thing is going to happen with something like government data, or basically any big institution like that. I think you could approach this a couple of different ways. If you have a focus group, if you have a smaller group that you can talk to of the inmates, give them a free choice field and basically use it as research. What happens? What comes back from that? You could start with a set of options. You could also say some prompts. I did that in my survey. So for a couple of things, I said, physical traits such as, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that people would know, what are some of the options out there? What are the things that I'm suggesting could possibly be in this? And hopefully that sparked ideas beyond that. But yeah, it makes our jobs a lot harder to do this, but it's also really important. Imagine if you're that inmate and you finally, after all of the ways that you are literally shoved into boxes, you finally get the chance to express yourself. You finally get a box that fits you. Imagine how powerful that is. Also, I really want to see that data.
It's coming. we are working on it. It's coming.
Yeah, well, thank you for that response. So we have another question from Rose Porta, who asks, how do you balance between simplicity and inclusion? For example, when you are running a regression model, the way I learned it, each category of a categorical variable becomes a separate binary variable, and the more variables you add, the more complex the model becomes. And I learned that the simplest model is the most accurate. So we learn to aggregate categories with small sample sizes to simplify. I'm thinking when I do this, some who read the report of the model results may not see themselves represented in the model.
Yeah, that's a great point, kind of building on what I was just talking about with Chad. So I'm gonna answer in two parts. Stick with me for both of them. The first one is, just because you have asked yourself these questions, just because you have identified that there is a need or there's another way to do something or there are things that you need to consider, doesn't necessarily mean it will end up in your data. So going back to what Chad said, he may want a free text field, but realize that the viable option is a multi-choice. Is that the absolute best? Maybe not, but is it going to get a whole lot closer than two little circles? Choose one. Yeah, it is. So if you're running the kind of analysis where you need fast results, or literally the only information you have is binary, you can say, whether it's the way that you design your visual, whether it's in your footnotes, whether it's in, a presentation of your data, you can say, this isn't great. This isn't accurate. But, just like you would report your margin, your margin of error, or, whatever you're using. And, just like you would report all of those statistical components, another part of that is saying, we simplified this because X, and justify that. So that's the first answer, is that being aware, asking the questions, knowing that this is something that you need to do, doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it every time. It's the awareness that matters. So you might still end up with a binary, that's fine. It's still useful in certain circumstances. Now, let's go to part two. That may not be the right analysis. You don't have to jump to that analysis because it's the one you've always used. You don't have to jump to that analysis because that's what everybody else in the field is using. You can chuck that analysis out the window and do something else that is more accurate, that is more inclusive, that does answer these issues that you've raised, these flags that you've put up and said, hey, this isn't okay. we're only giving 2 options, and I know that that's not accurate. So this model, this statistical analysis isn't the right one for our data. So that's kind of the 2 parts of that. But the whole critical foundation of that is that you are examining, you are raising flags, you are examining, you are questioning. Where you go from there is going to be much better informed and much richer, because you're coming from a foundation of curiosity and expansion and inclusion, rather than, this is what we got. Okay, cool. Red and blue for political colors, we're done.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, our next question is from Lucinda Brock, who asks, hi, I'm a first-year student taking Introduction to Data Science. Do you have a favorite/preferred binary variable to use instead of male/female for when using binary variables might be necessary?
Oh, what a fascinating question. So a really in-depth look at it, building on what I just said. I think a lot of that would depend on what you're getting at. It would depend on what you need to show. I think it would be pretty context dependent. I'm trying to think off the cuff of, if you were forced to put people into a binary, what other words could you use? One, don't use male and female. So I mentioned that in the talk. There's male and female tend to be associated with biology, and frankly, always get out of people's pants unless you have consent. So don't look at biology, and male and female pushes that way. So if you have to use it, use man and woman. If there's some way that you could get out of it, I would say presenting masculine, presenting feminine, or masculine presenting, feminine presenting. That's not perfect. It's closer. When I was pretending to be a woman, I was by no means feminine presenting. But that people also assumed that I was a woman, and I kind of leaned that way. So I think that that's one of those of being very careful, doing a lot of research, especially talking to people who are in the trans community, who are looking at gender, who have given a lot of thought to this. But if you do have something where you're not talking about people, so, you're selling widgets and you're selling, headphone jacks, and one part sticks out and one part sticks in, do not call those male and female. It's a plug and socket. There's actually a website, it might be a Tumblr out there, that goes through like a dozen different options. Cork and bottle was one of my favorites. So if you're not describing people, there's plenty of other options. If you are, it's going to take some work. Think about it. But I love that you asked the question. It's perfect. Exactly the question you should be asking.
All right, I think it's my turn, right, Emily?
About to hand it over to you.
I have the benefit of not having to type in my question, just be able to ask it. So many of the things that I think you've spoken about hit very, very close to home with a lot of our research within QSIDE, because we run into this conundrum in almost everything we do, right? And a major part of our sort of research ethos is thinking about systematized lack of representation, systematized mechanisms by which those reductionist labels that have historical context have been weaponized socially and used to decapitalize people and keep them, right, away from this. And a challenge that we run into, right, is that historically, even with those reductionist labels, right, even if we go back to male, female, man, woman for gender, right, even if we sometimes don't even have that data, right? And so part of what we do is invade, right? We go and find data sets, and then we then have methodologies to try to sort of elucidate what those, sort of infer what those data are to sort of show that bias and that historical problem. But it really feels fraught, right? It feels complicated and fraught. And I think that how we have talked about it internally is that so I think, well, one, I think that we will recommend to our kids to sort of do more of what you're talking about, right? I love this idea of representing even non-represented categories, right? And making sure that those have a space in the visuals, right? Even if they're zero, right? But I think the way that we've talked about, well, not I think the way we've talked about it is what we believe we're measuring is the historical reductionism and bias, right? That's what we're measuring in this moment. And we know that that has been weaponized. But I'm always interested to know, what do you think? What do others think about that, right? Like, do you have a reaction to that, or a way that we should begin to nuance our thinking about that?
So this is one of the reasons why I love working with you, and I especially loved working with the interns. I loved that Kendall, I hope she doesn't mind me shouting out, but she built that into using the data that you have. She built that into her visualization as well, with no prompting. She was like, this category doesn't exist, we need to include it. I'm a historian. I have my master's in history with a concentration in exhibit design. So so the idea of it's basically a meta analysis of saying, okay, we have the data, here's what the data tells us. Now, what can we say about what the data looks like? So there's what the data is like literally telling us, how many people in X category, Y category. But then there's why X and Y, and why not HJK categories. And so I love the idea of this historical look at the bias and calling it out. And that's a lot of what I meant with, census data is one that does this. That's the example that I used. But also, to Chad's point, government data does this. Anything that's usually big and reductionist, saying, what is the context in which this data was collected? And what does that mean for the data, for how we interpret it, how we look at it, and who is not in this data set? So the example of, hey, there are no people in Chinatown struggling with houses. Who's not represented in that data set? That is hugely important. And we need people doing exactly what you're doing, because you are expanding the base of these questions to ask. Every person who asks questions and puts that out there expands for the next person. Oh yeah, I should ask that. Oh yeah, I haven't thought about that with my data set, or with my artwork, or with my writing, or my blog posts, whatever it is that you're doing. The more people asking the questions and looking at this, the better we're going to get. We didn't get pronouns on whitehouse.gov because one person mentioned it once. So contributing to the conversation is always important. All these historical looks.
I love it. So Gaelan, we want to be respectful of your time. So we're at 5 o'clock. We do have one last question. So I'm going to be cruel and put you on the spot and ask this one last question. Do you have some flexibility with your stop time, or do you?
Absolutely. I'm here for this. This is great.
I'm loving it. Emily, I'll take privilege since we're running over and just run with this last question. So I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but I hope you will correct me at some point. So Nana has asked, when accounting for identity markers and data analyses, I want to avoid suggesting that these are somehow predictors. For example, not saying that being a woman makes you more likely to leave STEM, but instead something like the STEM environment causes those who identify as women to leave more frequently. Any tips on how to navigate this kind of language?
Oh, snaps to that. Oh, fantastic. I love that. Really critical component, really important component. Actually, almost identical to the questions that we're asking in our diversity report, which is, you know, when are associates leaving the firm? At what point are women leaving earlier? Are Black people leaving earlier than white people, et cetera? And you're absolutely right. And that's part of this contextualizing the data. Who is the actor and who is the action done on? You see this a lot in victim-based language. So I don't want to put out any activating language out there, but if you talk about, like, if you're talking about what somebody did wrong to have something bad happen to them, you're looking in the wrong place. You got to look at what was the actor doing the thing, doing the bad thing. And that's, to your point, the environment and STEM. Okay, now we're looking at the actor. Now, what does the environment and STEM mean? Because environment is very nebulous. So who is doing that acting? Name it, name them. Put the laser focus where it belongs, because the laser focus has been so focused on the women leaving STEM and not focused on who is making it so that they're not staying. So I think your phrasing is the perfect stepping stone. So you say, okay, I'm not going to focus on who the action is being done to, I'm going to focus on who the actor is. Now, I've looked at that in a broad sense. Okay, that's gotten me this far. Now I know where I need to look. Okay, who is actually doing that thing? So not women, we're going to look at the environment. Who's part of the environment? It's the people doing the hiring. It's the people who are sponsoring papers. It's the grant sponsors. It's your lab mates, who, it's the design of the lab is not for shorter people. It's a real concern. And, most women tend to be shorter. So if that drives you out of the lab, that's the question that you're going to get to, because you have shifted your focus. I hope I'm actually answering your question, but I love it so much that I want to just keep talking about it. If I haven't fully answered it, then let me know in the coffee cocktail hour.
The news is that is a perfect segue to invite everyone to join us if you have some flexibility in your schedule. I will put the Zoom link here, so everybody take a moment and copy it if you're getting it. I want to take one more quick moment to just thank you so much, Gaelan. It's been just so enlightening. And I have, never want to use words like woke, but I realize how not woke I am and how much work I have to do. So it's just really helpful to learn from people who are helping us. This is exactly what we envisioned with this. So just thank you so much.